You did what? With them? How could you, Mark? They're my sisters. My voice cracked as I tried to comprehend the words that had just shattered my world. I could barely breathe, my chest tightening with a pain so sharp it felt like I was being stabbed. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Lisa, Mark's voice wavered, but I didn't let him finish. I couldn't. I threw the phone across the room, watching it clatter against the wall and fall to the floor in pieces. I wanted to scream, to cry, to break something, anything that would make the pain stop. Instead, I crumpled onto the couch, my body shaking as the reality of what I had just learned settled over me like a suffocating blanket. My husband. My sisters. How could they do this to me? How could they betray me like this? Looking back, it all seemed so surreal, like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. If someone had told me that my life would implode the way it did, I would have laughed in their face. Mark and I had been married for 5 years, and I thought I knew him better than anyone. We had our ups and downs like any couple, but I never imagined that he would betray me, especially not with my own sisters. It all started innocently enough. My sisters, Jenna and Julia, had always been close. They were twins, identical in almost every way except for their personalities. Jenna was the wild one, always up for a party or an adventure, while Julia was quieter, more reserved. But despite their differences, they were inseparable. Growing up, they were like two halves of the same person, always finishing each other's sentences and sharing secrets that no one else was privy to. I used to envy their bond. As the older sister by 5 years, I was often the outsider, watching from the sidelines as they formed their own little world. But I loved them fiercely, and I always thought they loved me too. That's why it hurt so much when I found out what they had done. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was sitting in the kitchen, flipping through a magazine while Mark was out running errands. The twins had come over for lunch, something we did occasionally to catch up and spend time together. We were sitting at the table, sipping iced tea and chatting about nothing in particular when Jenna mentioned something that made my stomach turn. Mark's been really sweet to us lately, she said with a sly smile, glancing at Julia, who blushed and looked away. What do you mean? I asked, narrowing my eyes at the way they exchanged knowing looks. Just that he's been, more attentive, Jenna replied, twirling a strand of hair around her finger. He's always offering to help us out with things, like fixing stuff around the house or giving us rides when we need them. I felt a flicker of unease in my chest. He's just being nice. That's the kind of person he is. Sure, Julia mumbled, avoiding my gaze. But something about their tone set off alarm bells in my head. There was a tension in the room that I couldn't quite put my finger on, and it made me feel like I was missing something important. I brushed it off at the time, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. But the feeling lingered, nagging at the back of my mind. The following weeks were a blur of work and everyday life, but that sense of unease never fully went away. Mark was acting strangely too, coming home later than usual, brushing off my questions with vague excuses. He seemed distant, distracted, like he was keeping something from me. But every time I tried to confront him about it, he would smile and tell me not to worry, that everything was fine. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that our marriage was as solid as I thought it was. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know how wrong until that fateful day. It was a Friday evening, and I had just finished a long day at work. I was exhausted, but I had promised Mark that I would pick up dinner on my way home. I called him as I left the office, but he didn't answer. I tried again as I pulled into the driveway, but still nothing. Figuring he was in the shower or something, I let myself into the house, my arms full of takeout bags. Mark? I called out as I set the bags on the kitchen counter. The house was eerily quiet, and a sense of foreboding settled over me. I made my way through the house, checking the living room, the bedroom, but there was no sign of him. It wasn't until I reached the hallway that I heard it, a low murmur of voices coming from behind the closed door of the guest room. My heart skipped a beat as I crept closer, my ears straining to catch the words. The door was cracked open just enough for me to see inside, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There, on the bed, were Mark and my sisters, Jenna on one side, Julia on the other, their bodies tangled together in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My entire world shattered in that moment, the betrayal cutting deeper than any wound I had ever experienced. I wanted to scream, to burst through the door and tear them apart, but I was frozen in place, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. How long has this been going on? I managed to choke out, my voice trembling with a mix of rage and despair. Mark's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock as he scrambled off the bed. Lisa, I can explain. Don't, I spat, holding up a hand to stop him. Just don't. How could you do this to me? With them? Jenna and Julia looked just as shocked as Mark, but there was no mistaking the guilt on their faces. Lisa, we're so sorry, Julia started, but I cut her off. Sorry? You're sorry? You betrayed me. Both of you. I was shaking now, my hands clenched into fists as the anger boiled over. You're my sisters. How could you do this? How could you sleep with my husband? They both started talking at once, their voices a jumbled mess of apologies and excuses, but I couldn't hear them over the roar of blood in my ears. I turned on my heel and fled the room, not caring where I was going, only that I needed to get away from them. I ended up in the backyard, collapsing onto the cold, hard ground as sobs racked my body. I couldn't believe this was happening. I couldn't believe the people I loved and trusted most in the world had betrayed me in the worst way possible. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Mark tried to talk to me, to explain, but I couldn't bear to look at him, let alone listen to his pathetic excuses. I locked myself in the bedroom, blocking out the sound of his desperate pleas from the other side of the door. The next few days were a nightmare. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think about anything other than the image of Mark with my sisters. It haunted me, tainted every memory we had ever shared. I felt like my entire life had been a lie, that everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my family, was nothing more than an illusion. Eventually, I knew I had to confront them. I couldn't avoid it forever. So, I called a family meeting. Mark, Jenna, Julia, and I all sat around the dining room table, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. No one spoke at first, the silence stretching out uncomfortably as we all avoided each other's eyes. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Why? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Why did you do it? Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes focused on the table in front of him. I don't know, Lisa. It just happened. It just happened? I repeated, my voice rising with anger. You don't just accidentally sleep with someone, Mark. Let alone two people, who just so happen to be my sisters. Jenna spoke up then, her voice uncharacteristically quiet. We never meant for it to go this far, Lisa. It started out as just, I don't know, flirting, I guess. But then one thing led to another, and I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't fix this, I snapped, glaring at both of them. You've ruined everything. Our family, our marriage. How could you be so selfish? Julia, who had been silent up until now, finally looked up, tears streaming down her face. We never wanted to hurt you, Lisa. We love you. Love? You call this love? I shot back, my voice thick with emotion. You don't do this to someone you love. You don't destroy their life just because you couldn't control yourselves. How could you even look me in the eye after what you did? Julia's tears fell harder now, her hands shaking as she reached across the table, desperate to close the gap between us. But I couldn't bear her touch. I flinched away, feeling a fresh wave of anger and pain wash over me. I'm sorry, Lisa, she whispered, her voice trembling. I'm so sorry. I know it doesn't change what we did, but please, you have to believe me. We never meant for this to happen. I could see the sincerity in her eyes, the regret etched into every line of her face. But it wasn't enough. Nothing could ever be enough to erase the betrayal I felt, the deep, festering wound they had left in my heart. How long? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. How long has this been going on? Jenna and Julia exchanged a glance, the guilt in their expressions making my stomach churn. 6 months, Jenna finally admitted, her voice so quiet I almost didn't hear her. 6 months. For half a year, they had been sneaking around behind my back, lying to me, betraying me. The realization was like a punch to the gut, knocking the breath from my lungs. I felt sick, disgusted by the thought of them together, of all the lies they had told me, all the times they had smiled in my face while stabbing me in the back. I turned to Mark, who was sitting there with his head in his hands, refusing to look at me. And you, I said, my voice shaking with fury. You were supposed to be my husband, my partner. How could you do this to me? I'm sorry, he mumbled, his voice barely audible. I was weak. I made a mistake. A mistake? I echoed, incredulous. A mistake is forgetting our anniversary or leaving the toilet seat up. This was a choice. A choice you made over and over again, every time you slept with them. How could you? Mark finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with regret. I don't know, Lisa. I don't know what came over me. It just happened. Stop saying that. I shouted, slamming my hand down on the table. Things don't just happen. You knew what you were doing every single time and you still chose to betray me. I trusted you, Mark. I thought you loved me. I do love you, he said, his voice cracking. I do. But I messed up. I messed up so badly, and now I'm losing everything that matters to me. You're right, I said, my voice cold and hollow. You are losing everything. Because I'm done. We're done. I could see the fear and desperation in his eyes as he realized the gravity of what I was saying. Lisa, please. Don't say that. We can work through this. We can go to therapy, get help. I'll do anything. Just please, don't leave me. But it was too late. The love I once felt for him had been tainted, poisoned by his betrayal. I couldn't look at him without seeing the lies, the deceit, the complete and utter disregard for our marriage vows. No, Mark, I said, my voice firm. This isn't something we can fix. You destroyed us. You destroyed me. And I can't ever forgive you for that. I stood up, pushing my chair back so hard it nearly toppled over. I couldn't be in that room for another second, couldn't look at their faces and be reminded of the pain they had caused me. I'm leaving, I said, my voice trembling with the finality of my decision. I need to get away from all of you. Don't try to contact me. With that, I turned and walked out of the house, not stopping even as Mark called after me, his voice filled with panic. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. All I knew was that I needed to get as far away as possible from the people who had hurt me. The drive was a blur. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white, my mind racing with a million thoughts and emotions. Anger, sadness, betrayal, disbelief, it all swirled together in a chaotic storm that left me feeling numb and hollow. Eventually, I ended up at a small motel on the edge of town, the kind of place no one would think to look for me. I checked in without saying a word, barely registering the sympathetic look the clerk gave me as he handed over the key. I didn't want sympathy. I didn't want anything. I just wanted to be alone. The room was small and dingy, with peeling wallpaper and a faint smell of mildew, but it was exactly what I needed. I dropped my bag on the bed and sank into a chair by the window, staring out at the empty parking lot as the sun dipped below the horizon. The reality of what had happened was starting to sink in, and with it came a crushing wave of grief. I had lost everything, my marriage, my family, my sense of self. The life I had built with Mark was gone, reduced to rubble by his betrayal. And my sisters, how could they do this to me? How could they destroy the bond we shared for something so fleeting, so meaningless? I spent the next few days holed up in that motel room, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions that had taken over my life. I didn't answer the phone when it rang, didn't respond to the countless messages from Mark, Jenna, and Julia. I just needed time to think, to figure out what I was going to do next. One evening, as I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the flickering TV without really seeing it, my phone buzzed again. I reached for it, expecting another message from Mark or my sisters, but this time it was different. It was a text from my best friend, Sarah. "Lisa, I'm so sorry. I just heard what happened. Please, let me know if you need anything. I'm here for you." The tears I had been holding back for days finally broke free, and I sobbed uncontrollably, clutching the phone to my chest. Sarah had always been there for me, through thick and thin, and now, in my darkest hour, she was still there, offering her support. I didn't deserve a friend like her, but I was so grateful to have her in my life. I knew I couldn't hide away in that motel room forever. I needed to face the reality of what had happened and start picking up the pieces of my shattered life. And I needed to do it with the support of the people who truly cared about me, people like Sarah, who had never betrayed my trust. So, I called her. The moment I heard her voice on the other end of the line, I broke down again, telling her everything, about Mark, about Jenna and Julia, about the betrayal that had torn my life apart. She listened without interruption, her voice calm and steady as she reassured me that I was strong, that I would get through this, that I wasn't alone. Sarah convinced me to come stay with her for a while, to give myself the space I needed to heal. I packed my things the next morning and left the motel behind, not looking back as I drove toward her house. I knew it was the right decision, the first step in reclaiming my life. When I arrived at Sarah's, she greeted me with a warm hug, holding me tight as I broke down once more. She didn't say anything, just let me cry until I had no tears left. It was exactly what I needed, someone who would just be there, without judgment or expectations. Over the next few weeks, I slowly started to rebuild my life. It wasn't easy, every day was a struggle to get out of bed, to find a reason to keep going. But with Sarah's help, I started to find that reason. I started going to therapy, talking through the pain and anger that had consumed me. It was hard, but it was necessary. And gradually, day by day, I started to feel like myself again. I started to see a future that wasn't defined by the betrayal I had suffered, but by the strength I had found within myself. I knew I would never forget what Mark and my sisters had done to me, but I refused to let it define me. One evening, as Sarah and I sat on her porch, watching the sunset, I turned to her and said, "I think I'm ready." She looked at me, her eyes filled with understanding. Ready for what? To move on. To start fresh. To let go of the past and build a new life for myself. Sarah smiled, squeezing my hand. "I'm so proud of you, Lisa. You're stronger than you know." I smiled back, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time in months, I felt hopeful. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I was ready to face it, whatever it might bring. As I watched the sun dip below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I made a promise to myself. I would survive this. I would thrive. And I would never, ever let anyone betray me like that again. The past would always be a part of me, but it wouldn't define me. I was more than the pain, more than the betrayal. I was Lisa, and I was stronger than they ever knew.